I think with China, the reason it's in a different class is it is a true adversary. It has unique capabilities to challenge America as the global superpower, unique economic capabilities, unique natural resources, unique influence around the world, unique military capability, the capacity. I think in the end, if you said you have to make a bet on which economic model is more appealing for success over the next decade, you would pick the United States, free, the innovation, the liberty, the individual freedom. But China, because of its unique top-down government, can move capital very quickly and can marshal data, which is a key part of the AI revolution.
Senator Dave McCormick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Roger. Good to be with you, my friend. Thanks for having me.
Honored to have you here. Love chatting policy and politics with you, and now get to do it from your perch on Capitol Hill, where I see you're accompanied by the old glory and Ronald Reagan. So I like the setup there on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, well, listen, I moved into my office here in the Hart Building. Now, I was in the basement. They put the new guys in the basement just to make sure they put you in your place. And we had this incredible flags that we were able to get. And what the flag behind me is a 13-star flag. No, 36-star flag. I think at the time Nevada came into the Union, and it's a mid 1800s flag, and we've got a couple of them in the office. But you sort of come into the office and you're reminded of the greatness of our country and also the incredible history.
Well, it's funny. We'll pick up on the word history and your role as a senator from Pennsylvania, from our founding and of our republic. Pennsylvania has been front and center. And actually, one of the things I wanted to hit on today was how Pennsylvania is in front and center, it seems to be, with the national conversation on tariffs and President Trump's focus on tariffs and trying to strengthen the American economy, and particularly American manufacturing. And from where I sit, Senator McCormick, you're in the heart of that, particularly as it relates to Pennsylvania, tariffs and steel. And at the time of this recording, President Trump's increased the tariffs for steel from 25% to 50%, as I understand it, excluding the UK. Maybe just take a second to give us your outlook on this. You led on this during your campaign for your seat, and it continues to be something you're leading on in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, well, it's thanks. Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that Pennsylvania is at the center of things. It's at the center of things politically. It's the swingiest of swing states. It's got 19 electoral votes in the Electoral College, and President Trump. There were 7 swing states in the 24 cycle. That were up for grabs for the Senate, and the only one we won was Pennsylvania. President Trump won all 7 of those, and so I think it's kind of fair to say that Pennsylvania is a really critical political place at the moment, and a place that sort of represents what's happening in terms of the shift of our politics, and the Republican Party is becoming much more of a working family party. Roger, you and I talked about this, and. I think back to Ronald Reagan a bit, because a lot of what we're going to talk about is sort of grounded in Reagan economic, but even President Reagan had a sort of a populist element of his thinking. And I mentioned to you before, but when I was out at the Reagan Library and walked into the replica Oval Office, there was one portrait on the wall there of a president, and the portrait was ironically Andrew Jackson. And if you walked into President Trump's office in the first term, I don't know if it's this term, it was Andrew Jackson. So Pennsylvania reflects the rise of the populism. And what's happening is this blend of traditional Reagan republicanism and the populist pulse that's reflected in the fact that the economy and the country hasn't been serving working families well. And so the Republican coalition is becoming a working family coalition. And there's a couple different dimensions of what has animated working people, and we can talk about that. But at the top of the list is globalization, and essentially unfair trading practices. And President Trump has put his finger on this in 2016. I think he was even more articulate about it in the 24 election. And it's the basic premise that after World War II, we gave Europe a great deal. We opened up our markets to Europe. Europe developed a set of protectionist policies over time, but we embraced Europe. helped bring it into the global economy. The same with Japan. We did the same thing with China 20 years later, where we embraced it to bring its people out of poverty. But what's happened is been a solidification of a very uneven, a very unfair set of trading practices. I'd go so far as to say there's no country in the world, no major developed country that is as open to investment, the absence of non-trade barriers, the lack of subsidies in general, and the lack of tariffs compared to any place else in the world. And so that's what President Trump was trying to address. The consequence of that unfairness is that we've had key industries move offshore. Our U.S. businesses don't have access to markets around the world. The unfair trading practices of China in particular have stolen intellectual property, built technology capability that's been able to compete with the United States. And probably most frightening, we've had key industries that are critical to our national security, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, that have moved entirely offshore. So this isn't like a 5% problem where you need to kind of modestly adjust policy. This is a big problem where you need to do a very significant turn of the steering wheel.
Let me follow up on a couple of items. You framed it really well, no doubt. The voters in Pennsylvania elected you because you're able to explain this. But you also come from a background, Senator McCormick, where you recognize growth is essential. Growth is a good thing for the economy. It's good for Americans. It's good for the American worker. Reducing trade barriers seems to be the objective. We want to be able to export our goods as much as be able to import goods. In Pennsylvania, you had the case of steel. In particular, an acquisition, the Nippon acquisition of U.S. Steel, and it got held up in a regulatory body or committee known as CFIUS. Won't go into that. It sounds like an illness, but it's actually a committee to protect investment in the United States that might impact national security, and steel is critical there. But the outcome was kind of interesting to me, and you were, I think, in the heart of it, both running for the Senate seat and now since you've been in the Senate, where we got the investment, but at the same time, we didn't give up U.S. ownership, as I understand it, of what is an essential element of our economy, but also national security. That is, U.S. Steel remains owned by the United States in the sense of a U.S. company owning it.
Yeah. Well, let me describe what I think we're trying to achieve with tariffs,
Yeah.
and I'll talk about the Nippon deal. But to me, America first and a dynamic American economy means fairness in our trading relationships. So I can't speak for President Trump or anybody else, but for me, the best thing that could happen with the reciprocal tariffs is that everybody lowers their tariffs. So I would like to see unfettered trade with our allies around the world, and I think what we're trying to solve is they're unfair to us. That's primarily the goal, in my opinion. The second goal is to create an environment that brings in lots of foreign investment. So the dynamic U.S. economy also, we have plenty of capital in the United States, but also draws in foreign capital, like the Nippon deal. I was in the United Arab Emirates last week. They're going to invest $1.4 trillion in the United States. I want to make sure that comes to Pennsylvania. Data centers, artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing. So the kind of economy we want, I think, has three things globally. It has, number one, fairness of trade. Hopefully we get that by reducing all barriers rather than making it reciprocal. But either way, it's a much better outcome than it has been for U.S. Companies. Second, where foreign capital flows into our environment, because we've already said we're going to have energy dominance, low energy cost, deregulation. We want that foreign investment in the United States. There's $20 billion of FDI in Pennsylvania, 330,000 jobs dependent on it. The third thing we want, which is where there's a tension, I think a healthy one, is there's certain industries that no matter what, we want them here.
Yeah.
Or in the hands of our closest allies. We want semiconductor industry here at home. We're going to have to create non-pure market solutions to do that. We're going to have to create subsidies and draw private capital to be able to do that. Pharmaceuticals. During COVID, we learned that 95% of the pharmaceutical supply chains are in China and India. Completely lost control of that for the United States. So not everything's strategic and not everything's critical to our national security, but some things are. And the U.S. Steel deal was one where it was. And it wasn't ownership so much as control. So the key was to be able to get the Nippon's investment, but to not have it get out of the hands of U.S. leadership and a U.S. Board structure that would protect America's interest.
You talk about industrial policy, didn't use those words, but that was something that you and I had a chance to work on together, looking at how we restore manufacturing in the United States. And now you're in the heart of public policy, where you get to work on this in the U.S. Senate. The narrow area that I hear you saying industrial policy would be appropriate or something you would consider would be in that third category, where national security and the need to have ownership control in the United States becomes essential. Semiconductors is the first one that you listed, and I agree with. I think that's essential, given what a 21st century economy needs to look like. Why should we have confidence, though, that when government puts its thumb on the scale, as it were, that it can yield the outcomes that we want? You and I debated this maybe a few years ago. Should we have confidence that government can actually deliver the outcome we need from a national security standpoint?
Yeah, no, you should be highly skeptical. Highly skeptical. It was that great Ronald Reagan line about, the scariest words in the English language is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, right?
Yeah.
We should have deep skepticism. And I think the key principles that one should employ is that we want to create an environment where private capital can flood into the areas that we think are most important for our national security. We may stimulate that with public capital, but we want private capital. So, for example, the DARPA in Department of Defense, Roger, which you know well, sometimes plays a role in getting early technology started before the private sector is going to invest. James and I, James Cunningham, who you know well, we wrote a book.
The co-author in Superpower in Peril.
Superpower in Peril. We talked about creating a fund that would co-invest with private capital, with the explicit principle that the government's not picking winners or losers. We don't want the government deciding which companies can win or lose. We want the government creating an environment where private capital. So if you had a fund, as we described in the book, which would essentially create even greater economic incentives by if you co-invested, the fund would cap its level of return. So the taxpayers would get a capped level of return and maybe take the first loss. That would make private capital more likely to be drawn into an area like quantum computing or other areas. We have a lot of capital going into artificial intelligence right now, so I don't think there's an issue there.
Right.
But there are certain areas where we need to have the government play a basic role. The other area, which is sort of running counter to the moment we're in, Roger, but it's consistent with what I've always thought, which is our investment in basic research.
Yes.
The foundational research that's going to go into innovation. The private sector often doesn't fill the basic research void. It takes the basic research and then invests in applied research that can commercialize it. So that basic research is something that other countries do. China invests an enormous amount of basic research. If you look at what the U.S. government's done, we invest about as a fraction of what we did in 1950 in basic research. And that basic research investment in the 50s led to, our nuclear capability, the internet, enormous innovation in satellites and space. So that basic research is an important part of the government's role too. But again, never picking winners and losers.
Yeah, it absolutely catapulted the private sector, and that's where you see the virtuous cycle there when you have government. And basic research is a great example where we've done that well, perhaps come off of it of late. Certainly business abhors risk. And just to hit on tariffs for a little bit longer, the volatility that we're seeing right now, the tariffs going up and down and back and forth, it does present a threat to the economic growth that we all seek, that all Americans can benefit from. I know you've spoken publicly about the trade deals that are on the horizon, or perhaps even closer, right, near term here, that we can get out of the tariff discussion coming out of the White House. Can you talk a little about where you hope this lands, where you think it might land in terms of the deals that will come out of these tariffs, where ultimately, as I think you just said a moment ago, you hope that the barriers come down on all sides.
Well, let me start with you. I made the point. I think the idea of a policy of reciprocal tariffs to get free trade or fairer trade, I should say, not free trade, it was a good goal. The president campaigned on it. I campaigned on it, so I'm supportive of that. Second, there's this question of whether the president actually has the authority to do it. There's been, a piece of he's applied IEPA, his emergency authorities, to do this. I voted in the Senate that I believed he should be able to use those authorities, and the reason I voted for that is I really do think we're in a national.
What would be an emergency authority, right? You would say this was an emergency.
It's an emergency authority, yeah, and I think that's based on three things. I think it's based on the fact that our trade deficit has ballooned the way it has. I think it's based on the fact that the flow of fentanyl into our country, particularly in the southern border, is of epic proportion. 100,000 losses last year, as you know, Roger. That's twice the number of people that died in Vietnam. And I think it's emergency authority in the fact that industries, and we learned this during COVID, that are so critical to our national security are literally no longer in the control of the United States government. If we were in a hot war with many countries around the world, we would be stranded. So I support that, and I also think, as a practical matter, the president is not going to be able to do what he needs to do in terms of negotiating if it looks like the Congress, is able to second guess everything he does. So that's why I voted for that. Now, in terms of the rollout. What I've said to the White House and to the team is the framework they laid out, was a starting point, but it's created, and the president said this, it's been bumpy because people are trying to figure out if they're going to move to another country, what the tariff regime is going to be there.
Right.
In many cases, to bring it back on shore, it's going to be a multi-year process. So it's created both uncertainty in the markets as well as a pause on capital. No, that hasn't shown, in fairness, it hasn't shown up in the economic numbers, but we definitely see some of that, and we're in constant touch with companies in Pennsylvania. What I've encouraged the administration to do is a couple things. Number one, get out as many deals as possible.
Yes.
And show the people where this is headed. I think that'll squeeze some of the uncertainty out. Business people hate uncertainty. Second thing, there's all these deals lined up. I was with Kevin Hassett yesterday, and he told me there's like 20 deals that are in various stages of negotiation. We're probably not going to get all those done in the 90 days. So my feeling is if a country's negotiating in good faith, the current tariff regime should be extended if there's good faith negotiations. I think the 10% tariff is likely to be some version of what stays, and then I think it'll be different by country. And my hope is, I'm not sure if this will. I do believe that countries with which we already have a free trade agreement should probably be treated differently in some form.
Right.
So that's the outline of the principles. I think if you talk about where the biggest risk is, where the challenge is, it's China. So I hope when the dust settles, what we'll have is a much higher degree of fairness. I hope we'll have a set of trade relations that in some ways isolate China. And I hope we'll have a relationship with China that is much more fair and fundamental. I think of all the trade agenda, the toughest nut's going to be China.
Well, I'm glad you ended with China, because I want to jump into that in just a minute. To me, this Liberation Day and the deal that should come and putting this off for 90 days, you would get tremendous momentum if you had deals in place and sort of set the standard of what this could look like. And it would sort of show that light where everybody should follow. It's encouraging to hear that in your conversation with Kevin Hassett, the National Economic Council, that there's up to 20 of these that are ready to go, and not just for reducing the risk profile, getting the markets to move, but demonstrating where this thing is intended to land. And I think there are a lot of people who share your view, Senator McCormick, where, hey, this is the U.S. standing up for itself, making sure that trade is indeed fair for that worker in Pennsylvania, but now it's going to be easier for goods to get out and goods to come in, as opposed to Americans paying more for goods at Walmart or elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree with you, Roger. The one thing I would say is, and listen, my thinking on this, I was negotiating with China 20 years ago when I was in the Treasury. And my, I call myself now a fair trader, because I believe the vision of China opening and the European Union being fair and so forth is not been it's not come to fruition. So I believe the president had the right goal here. And there's some of my friends who say, yeah, but if he'd have done it much more, incrementally and much more,
Right.
but to be fair, right now the conversation that we're having, you and I are having, and that everybody's having, whether it's Wall Street or CEOs, it's 100%, it's 180 degrees different than it was in January 1st of last year. In the following sense, everybody believes, for the most part, that an effort to achieve fairness, a tough-minded, even to our closest allies, we've got to have fairness. We got to reduce non-trade barriers. We got to get rid of subsidies, or we got to even the playing field. That's kind of accepted now. Just think about it. Just think about previous administrations. So I think President Trump, to his credit, has changed the whole conversation
Radically change the conversation. There's no question.
radically and created alignment. And now you and I are having a conversation about where I think the conversation should be, which is how do we implement that policy in a way that's going to result in tangible results of fairness. And people say to me, well, listen, our allies are never going to trust us again. You're beating the heck out of them on NATO. You're beating the heck out of them on trade. And the way I say it is, which I really feel it, is this is like a marriage. So most of these relationships like a marriage, whether it's Japan or Australia or South Korea, the European Union, not China. China's not like a marriage, but the others are like a marriage. And what's happening here is one partner in the marriage is saying, hey, it feels out of balance. It feels out of whack. I'm not happy with the marriage, and we need to make some adjustments to the marriage. That's what's happening. We're not saying we want to get divorced. We're not trying to get divorced from Canada or Mexico, the European Union. We're saying, listen, the marriage is out of balance. We need to get things back on track. And
So, go ahead. Sorry, finish up. Sorry about that.
yeah, I was just saying, I honestly believe had President Trump not come at it with the intensity, the ferocity, the comprehensive nature of it, then I don't think we would be in this conversation we're having. Now, we got to land the planes in a way that is good for America. I certainly accept that fact.
Yeah, and that's where I want to go, because there is this other side of it. We'll call it the non-Senator McCormick preferred outcome. Your preferred outcome, this results in more trade, barriers being reduced, both sides, right? And it's a fair trade environment for the U.S. There's another side that would like to see the barriers go up. There's a theory of the case that we need to bring manufacturing back into the United States, that the jobs that Americans have today, because unemployment is historically low, are not the sorts of jobs Americans should be doing. We need to be back to manufacturing. The only way we're going to get there is if, in fact, we lift those trade barriers up and rely on ourselves, not just for the semiconductors or the steel, but for everything else in the economy, or much of it. And they think that's the way to get there. We're skeptical about that with my Reagan training, and I'm not sure that's the outcome we want. And there's kind of an undercurrent of commentary somehow that the jobs that Americans have today are not the sorts of jobs that they should have, whether it's working at Walmart or some other place that's more on the service side of the economy.
Well, I think that the sort of two separate things. When I was a kid growing up in my hometown in Bloomsburg, we had the McGee carpet mill, 2,000 employees. There's a town of 8,000 people, 2,000 employees at the mill, and here we are 40 years later, and we have 200. And that town sort of shrunk. There's a college there where my dad worked, but it's not what it was. And that story repeats itself all across America, where America has lost the capacity to build things. In many cases, the percentage of jobs that are manufacturing based and so forth, we become much more of a service intensive economy. And I do think that part of that is a byproduct of the unfairness, the globalization, the things that we just talked about. So simply by making the trade regime fair by ensuring fairness, I think you're going to see much more onshoring. You're going to see certain jobs that weren't economic because of subsidies and other things come back to the United States. I think that's a good thing. And as we think about a world that's changing dramatically because of artificial intelligence, well, there's lots of jobs that are going to be lost. So the idea that other jobs are coming back here to be in the United States, I think is a good thing. But it's going to be driven by fairness. What you're talking about is certain industries where we're putting up protectionist barriers. We're saying we're not just trying to achieve fairness. We're trying to achieve a position where that industry can succeed here because of subsidies or protectionism. And I think that the way I think about that is I'm skeptical about that too, in certain ways. I think about a target with a bullseye in the middle. And the bullseye in the middle are those industries that we want to have in the United States for national security reasons. We
Got
don't
it.
want to be dependent on others. There's probably on that target 6 rings, and maybe the first, the bullseye, and maybe the first ring. I could imagine industries where we're saying, listen, we are going to subsidize, we're going to do things to make sure it's just unsatisfactory that we have a completely offshore pharmaceutical industry. It's just unacceptable that everything runs on semiconductors and most of them aren't made here. We are going to do things that are antithetical to pure market, free markets, because we want them here. Then the other areas, I'm much more reluctant. In other words, if we lived in a world where everybody lowered their trade barriers, I don't think there's a lot of jobs that are necessarily going to come back here. I don't necessarily think Americans would want those jobs, but beyond that, I don't think it's going to be economic without putting much more protectionist measures. So I think we should be very selective about that target. Those concentric
Yeah.
circles, very very concentric about where we decide something's in the bullseye.
Want to hit on China because you referenced that as the exception. We have our marriages with our allies and partners being Japan, South Korea, Australia, EU, the United Kingdom, and then you just said a moment ago, but China's not a marriage. It is something else, something different. Perhaps you can expand on that, and in doing so, that would be a place where barriers, perhaps you'd be comfortable with remaining high, that this is the sort of decoupling, is language I use, I'm not sure it's language you use, but that is strategic in nature, where it doesn't create dependency on China, certainly as it relates to things that are vital to our prosperity and certainly our national security. How do you see this all shaking out vis-a-vis China? Because that is the exception here, and we're in something like a Cold War. And as I referenced before, our watchers and listeners should look at your book, Superpower in Peril, where we do a great job of outlining how we ought to think about China in the context of a global economy.
Yeah, well, I think with China, the reason it's in a different class is it is a true adversary. It has unique capabilities to challenge America as the global superpower, unique economic capabilities, unique natural resources, unique influence around the world, unique military capability, the capacity. I think in the end, if you said you have to make a bet on which economic model is more appealing for success over the next decade, you would pick the United States, free, the innovation, the liberty, the individual freedom. But China, because of its unique top-down government, can move capital very quickly and can marshal data, which is a key part of the AI revolution. So China is a real adversary and has closed the gap dramatically in terms of being able to threaten America's interest. So I think we need to think about China a little bit differently. And there's really 2 pieces to that. One is we need to take extra care to protect ourselves defensively from China's bad behavior. It's stealing of intellectual property. It's insertion of essentially spies into American universities to try to steal our secrets. It's attempts to get the leading technology, whether it's NVIDIA chips or whatever it is a means for leapfrogging the United States. So the defensive posture is to treat China somewhat differently with export controls to make sure that if we're going to export to the UAE high capacity chips, that they don't have a secondary. There's a secondary sanction to make sure they don't go to China. To make sure that we take extra measures to ensure that the people that we're sharing intellectual property with doesn't find its way to China. To make sure that if we're training the great Chinese scientists, that they're staying in the United States and building America, that they're not stealing the intellectual property and going back.
Or training the next generation of PRC scientists. You know, this
Exactly.
is what's been happening in the education debate.
So I think we should approach China with a deep degree of skepticism and be on defense, because they are an adversary, and they could be very easily go from an adversary to an enemy. So I think we need to treat them with caution. But the true bulk of the effort, I think, to overcome China, ensure that we remain the global superpower, is offensive at home. So we got to protect them, but it's what we do. We have the greatest, most innovative economy in the world. We are the bright shining light on the hill for attracting the world's talent. If you look at the Fortune 500, half of the Fortune 500 was created by first generation immigrants or their children. We have the most robust rule of law in terms of protecting innovation, protecting patents. We have the greatest universities in the world. We have all sorts of problems. Don't get me wrong; our universities have all sorts of problems. We have all sorts of challenges, but we are still uniquely positioned to out innovate and be at the forefront of scientific discovery. We just got to make sure we stay on track in doing that. We got to fix our education system, our immigration system. We got to invest the way I described in basic research. We got to make sure that we policies that are deregulatory create the flow of capital into the right areas. It's in our hands, but we got to be smart about it.
So you're betting on the U.S. system. It's allowed us to win in the past, be it the Cold War, before the Cold War. But the question is, will we continue to play to our advantages given the competition we have today with the PRC, and as you rightly call them, an adversary? How do you think we're doing on that front right now? I mean, one of the most important contributions of the first Trump administration, we've spoken about this in the past, was identifying the People's Republic of China as an adversary. That seems to be the continued approach of Trump 2.0, the second Trump administration. But in some ways, I wonder if we're risking that. I'll give you one example. I know you led on this. Famously, the DOGE approach to foreign aid, calling out the excesses of USAID, has seen a lot of support, and there's certainly reason for DOGE to exact cuts on USAID. At the same time, with it has been an assault across all foreign aid, and in particular sorts of foreign aid that puts the screws on the PRC. Make sure that those within China and around China understand how they suppress freedoms, how they undermine and interfere with free peoples around the world. It's one of those examples, and there are others where perhaps the effort may be undermining what we're seeking to achieve. Certainly the things that you just outlined a moment ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got a challenge at the moment, and I think we can navigate through the challenge. But essentially, the challenge is that there is an enormous growth in government spending, like spiraling out of control under President Biden, $5 trillion of new spending. And the DOGE process, which I think was a great concept, came in and started to provide transparency on how we were spending that taxpayer money. And USAID, where we spend about $40 billion a year, showed all sorts of examples. Like, I know government a little bit. I was dumbfounded that we were spending USAID money on the LGBTQ operas or the different programs. And my friends on the Democratic side say, but it was only X percent or Y percent. This was a small percentage. And what I say is, listen, it's like being in a fancy restaurant and you lift your plate up and there's a cockroach. I no longer trust anything in the restaurant. Anyone that could have approved that is corrupt to its core. It's so deeply flawed. So I really think that, I'm sure there's good people at work at USAID, so I'm not trying to do a across the board slander, but the leadership that allowed even those things to happen, it was so deeply flawed. So that's the problem we're in. And I think the American people, President Trump, everybody has every right to be skeptical of our foreign assistance and what it's become. At the same time, as you say, we're fighting a global battle on multiple fronts, and one of the fronts is China's Belt and Road, where they have gone, and this is for decades. They go into countries and support with different aid. I remember being in Uganda 20 years ago, 15 to 20 years ago, and driving through the countryside and coming to a bridge in the middle of nowhere across a river, and there was a big sign that says "Compliments of the People's Republic of China." So they are building these relationships. It gives them access to military bases, access to rare earth metals, access to energy sources. And we've got to combat that Belt and Road expansion, mercantilist expansion around the world, with both ideas, where we are showing America to be the great model for freedom and capitalism, and also with resources that essentially build relationships. And so what I've tried to do is be a voice that says, listen, I saw the cockroach too. I'm disgusted. But let's be thoughtful about making sure that we continue to invest in the Belt and Road. And so,
Yeah, and it can't be something where as a result we're giving up the global South, for example, to the PRC or in our hemisphere, which the Trump administration is really led on and focusing. But now because we're cutting these funds, we don't have the ability to use the arm of government to go in and assert ourselves in regions that are absolutely critical to our security and our prosperity. I mean, I know Secretary Rubio would probably argue in this conversation that hasn't happened at all. And I guess from your perch on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and elsewhere to make sure that doesn't happen, and we're not giving up ground.
yeah, listen, what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be try to be very thoughtful. Is I'm going to be prepared, and I already have, to vote against unchecked foreign assistance. I think we need to really draw in our spending on foreign assistance and make sure it's very much in line. I think it took on an agenda, progressive ideology that was completely inconsistent with America's interests and with what the taxpayers want to pay for. But I will be a strong advocate for certain specific targeted types of foreign assistance that combat China, because I think this fight is the fight of our time. It's the existential fight, and we need to fight it with hard power. We just talked about it: military, technology,
Sure.
leadership, but also soft power, where we're building relationships with countries in Africa and Central and South America that are so critical to combating China on the global stage.
And I got to expect you have a great partner in Senator Rubio, Secretary Rubio, former Senator Rubio, also as National Security Advisor now, that they're going to reform, reorganize, and I'm sure in your position in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you're got the best sense of how they're going to reorganize USAID and some of this other funding to make sure that the beneficiary of DOGE is the United States, our foreign policy, our security, and not Beijing. I imagine you're in regular contact with Secretary Rubio on this.
Yes, well, he's come over a couple times. I think he's the right guy to lead on this for the reasons you just said. He knows the issues extremely well. He's been a very strong China hawk, as has President Trump. I mean, President Trump's both his policies and his voice on China have been very tough-minded. So I think we all share the goal. Now the question is how to make sure we have the right policies to counter China's influence around the world and here in the United States.
Well, Senator Dave McCormick of Pennsylvania. With the remaining time, I want to shift from our discussion around tariffs, trade, the People's Republic of China, Pennsylvania, and talk a little bit about a recent trip you took. I think the first foreign trip you took as an elected senator, and that was to the Middle East. You traveled to Israel as well as the United Arab Emirates. A critical time. Almost every week feels like a critical time in that region. But as the Trump administration is in Oman negotiating with Iran on a potential deal with the continued fight against Hamas, the IDF, Israel trying to destroy Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So much going on here. I'd love to just get a couple of minutes of your reflections on the trip and your thoughts, if you sit down, perhaps you already done so, with the President of the United States, what you would tell him based on what you saw and learned and discussed in the region.
Yeah, well, as you said, it was my first trip as the first trip since becoming a senator. My wife and I went. Dina went with me, and I'm the chairman, as you said, of the subcommittee on the Middle East and counterterrorism. And we went to the Emirates. United Arab Emirates talked about energy and AI and so forth. But we also talked about Iran and the existential threat. We met with the leadership there, the existential threat posed by Iran. And then we went to Israel. And I'd say there were two, maybe three big takeaways from the Israel trip. First, we had a chance to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the opposition leader Lapid, the president, and the unanimity, the complete agreement on Iran, the existential risk posed by Iran, the fact that Iran simply cannot have a nuclear weapon, it cannot have the ability to enrich. Any agreement must include complete dismantlement of the nuclear program, and just the uniformity of that belief across the political landscape, I think, could not have been more clear. President Trump has said it's got to be complete dismantlement, it's got to be enrichment. But through the eyes of the Israelis, I think quite appropriately, this could not be more existential. Iran has explicitly said the mullah's goal is to destroy Israel. They said the goal is to destroy the great state in the United States. This is not a country that can be allowed to have a nuclear weapon or a program that could yield a nuclear weapon. And that uniformity of view was very clear.
It's no longer surprising for those who follow us since the Abraham Accords, but you take perhaps a zooming out and a historical view that you have the Sunni country like the United Emirates viewing Iran in the same way effectively as Israel, and they're aligned in that front. Yet, at least it surprised me, I won't speak for you, that the Trump administration, with its envoy, Witkoff, contemplating some sort of deal with Iran that, depending on the reporting of the day, looks a lot like or similar or close to the JCPOA, the deal the Obama administration inked with Iran, that gave them some ability to enrich, and ultimately was a deal President Trump ran against in 2016 and tore up when he became president in 2017. From your role on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the chair of the subcommittee overseas, what are you doing in terms of the oversight and making sure the American people have a understanding of what is and is not on the negotiating table? Obviously, you have to have some deference to the executive to work this out. Yeah. You made quite clear that you would expect to be the right policy. How do you see this playing out in terms of a deal with Iran and the Trump administration?
Yeah. Well, listen, the president has been very clear. Even I try not to pay much attention to news reports, having just lived through a campaign and seeing everyday news reports that were complete manufactured and not accurate.
But they're negotiating. You know that much. There's something being transacted or shared across the table there.
I take President Trump at his word. Complete dismantlement. A number of senators and myself have written a letter just reinforcing the importance of complete dismantlement and no enrichment. I would hope that if the administration did a deal, that it would come through the Senate, appropriately so. And the reason for that is whatever the deal is, the president will want to make it permanent. And the only way to make it permanent is to come through the Senate, not have it be negotiated by the executive that can be overturned in the next administration. I think that's the safest way to protect the president's agenda and his priorities. So, listen, I expect the Senate to play a big role, a big voice in this. And I think the president is in a unique position to negotiate a good deal because I think Iran's at an all-time low. I mean, based on what the Israelis have done, they've completely incapacitated Hezbollah, significantly undermined Hamas, and really undermined and significantly deteriorated the military capacity of Iran. And so this is a moment, I think, where there's an opportunity, and I'm hopeful that the president and Steve Witkoff will be able to land a deal consistent with what they've talked about.
I do think, as you know, Israel has effectively extinguished Iran's ring of fire around its sovereign territory, and best we can tell in the public reporting, has destroyed or substantially destroyed Iran's air defenses. And so should Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government decide they wanted to take out what is, as you've outlined, an existential threat to their country, it would seem to be the right time to do it, despite reporting that President Trump has asked Prime Minister Netanyahu not to take action as he is negotiating. But there's a window there, And it seems like Israel's opportunity to deal with this threat is in the near term, in certainly weeks, months, not years.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we're at a moment where the opportunity to negotiate something that would be acceptable along the lines of what we've described is there, but it's also a moment of military weakness on the part of Iran, and I think we should recognize what we're dealing with here and be very skeptical of Iran. We should recognize that if they have the time to rebuild their terrorist network and capability, they will. I think it's a moment to keep the absolute pressure on, and hopefully it'll yield in a peaceful agreement. Nobody wants war and the damage that brings, but it also is the reality that certainly no one in Israel that I met, and I don't think the United States can tolerate a nuclear armed Iran or an Iran that's on the precipice of becoming nuclear armed. So that's the moment we're in. We'll see, but I agree with you. It's not a multi-year moment. It's a multi-week, multi-month moment.
Last question before we go to our lightning round. Great to have you on the show. This one comes back to home, and while you're out in the region or just returned, we saw another incident, another moment where American Jews were attacked by the rise in anti-Semitism. You've been a leading voice on this before you entered the Senate and certainly since. The latest one is Boulder, Colorado, where you had a rally in support of freeing the hostages in Gaza, was met with Molotov cocktails in Boulder, Colorado. Just before that, 2 employees of the Israeli embassy in Washington were murdered. And then in the state of Pennsylvania, the governor's mansion was attacked as well. And I don't know what the official reports are, but it certainly seemed to be tied to anti-Semitism as well. What is going on here? How are you speaking to your voters and citizens in Pennsylvania about this? There's a strong Jewish community there, and more broadly, what's your message to the American Jewish community?
Well, listen, it's absolutely a disgrace, these incidents that we've seen. As you know, Roger, soon following October 7th, I live in Pittsburgh and Squirrel Hill, around the corner from the Tree of Life. So if you want to list another example of just horrific anti-Semitism, it's the massacre that happened there. But
The Tree of Life Synagogue.
exactly. Right after October 7th, though, not long after, in that January, Dina and I, during the campaign, went to Israel. We saw firsthand what had occurred, the vicious, evil mass murder of Jews and Americans, Jewish Americans and Israeli Jews in the various communities. We went to Kfar Aza. We met with hostage families. It left an imprint on me that that will last forever. It was absolutely pure evil. And since that time, I've been very supportive of Israel's actions and the necessity of absolutely destroying Hamas and all its military capability and doing that was necessary. What surprised me was the anti-Semitism that we saw across the United States, particularly on our nation's campuses. And I'm not Jewish. I certainly knew that anti-Semitism lurked beneath the surface, but the degree where we have this unbelievable outpouring, these demonstrations, this explicit from the river to the sea, the physical intimidation of Jewish students on Penn's campus. A kid that worked for me had a McCormick hat on and an Israeli flag was attacked on
I didn't know that. Wow.
Pittsburgh campus. This is unbelievable, and so that was an absolute shocking thing for me. But the even more shocking thing was the absolute weak response of many public leaders, college presidents, Liz McGill at Penn, the president of Harvard, public officials, my opponent. I mean, it was just over and over again. Very few people were willing to speak out with complete moral clarity on the horror of anti-Semitism and the need to stamp it out. And we see this on and on. As you said, the governor in my state, who's Jewish, Governor Shapiro, an attempt on his family and his family's life with an arson of the governor's mansion, unthinkable. And so I'm horrified by it. I'm doing my best to try to be a voice for consistent, strong moral clarity. My fellow senator, Senator Fetterman, has been an extraordinary voice for moral clarity. We're very closely aligned on this. And also to start to think about the kind of legislative response we should have to put the right pressure on universities to have adequate response. Senator Rubio and I wrote an op-ed that said any student here on a student visa who violates the norms of behavior, we throw them out. They don't have the same privileges of an American citizen. If they're exercising behavior that's inconsistent with what we would have allowed had we known on the application that we're going to do it.
Sure.
And so I think this is going to require a hard edge. This is going to require a tough-mindedness, clarity, responsibility, pressure put on the university presidents. President Trump's doing that to his credit. So I think we're in the beginning of this. We're closer to the beginning of this fight than the end. But I'm going to be a champion of it.
Well, thank you for your leadership and being a champion and using the language of fighting. It has to be fought as one American Jew. I'm grateful for it. What's always distinguished America from other countries is that anti-Semitism in the United States, to the extent that it surfaced, was never state-sponsored. And our government has fought against it. It's a founding principle, I think, because we understand that the hate of anti-Semitism ultimately is anti-American. And leaders like you are grateful for your fight against it and continue to fight against it. We're at time here. Let me ask just one for a lightning round. Give us, Senator McCormick, your favorite Reagan speech, book, or quote. What do you have to share with us before we let you go back to your work in the United States Senate?
Well, my favorite, I just read Peggy Noonan's little book, When Character Was King. I read it because I was trying to remind myself of the literary flourish, how he could lift and inspire. And there's so many great speeches, but the speech in Berlin, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, I think is a classic. Just talk about moral clarity.
Yes.
What was encouraging, and my reading of that book, as I recall, was that wasn't in the speech. And that he put it right at the last minute. That was him.
The one that threw and saved it down, cut it out, and kept them putting it back in.
Exactly. And that clarity, that inspiration, that recognition that what distinguishes us was that we didn't need walls to keep our people in. That, I think, was Reagan at his best. Reagan with the clarity, Reagan with the strength, Reagan with the belief. And, he imagined a world that most people couldn't see. And by the time he left office, it was well on the way to becoming what he had hoped for. So it was,
I think that Reagan bust over your right shoulder just smiled a little more wider as you're giving that. Senator Dave McCormick, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Roger. Thanks for having me.